Welcome to the screencast where we will be addressing photosynthesis and overview. And so today we're looking at being able to describe first the structure of the chloroplast and be thinking, of course, how that chloroplast may or may not be similar and different to a mitochondrion. Number two, then looking at the phases of photosynthesis, again, the reactants, products, locations, and purpose of them. And then 2C, photosynthesis, thinking about photosynthesis as a series of redox reactions. And again, this is similar and different to what's going on in respiration. So here we go. To go backwards again, we've seen this now several times since the beginning of the year, where we're talking about energy conversions again, and how energy is converted from light energy by the producers in an ecosystem, and they're converting that light energy from converting the energy from light into organic molecules. We just came out of the unit where we talked about how those organic molecules in the presence of oxygen are oxidized to carbon dioxide and water, and then used to produce ATP to run the cell. So this is common to all eukaryotic cells that have mitochondria, and also common to prokaryotes that don't necessarily have a mitochondrion, but will do some of those very similar processes. From this point on, we're going to be sort of focusing now on the top part of this diagram here, going and looking at the details of primary production, where we're going to be taking carbon dioxide and water and using the energy in light to drive reactions that then produce organic molecules and oxygen as a byproduct. Okay, so chloroplast is where this is happening. If you are a primary producer and you are a eukaryote, you have a membrane-bound organelle that is known as the chloroplast. So the chloroplast is actually a triple membrane structure where we have an outer membrane right here, and then there's an inner membrane, but that outer and inner membrane are very tightly, they're really close together. So there's an intermembrane space, but it's very, very minimal. And then inside the inner membrane, right, so again, this is outer, this is inner. Inside the inner membrane, then there is a space that is called the stroma. Right? So the stroma is the space right, within the inner membrane. Okay. Then within that stroma, you have these stacks of disks that are also membranes. So this stack right here, they've kind of sectioned it. And these stacks of membranes, the membranes are called thylakoids. So there's a thylakoid membrane. And then inside of that membrane is another space that's known as the thylakoid space. Thylakoid space. So graphically organizing that, again, you would have cytoplasm, and then there's this outer membrane of the chloroplast, and then there's the inner membrane of the chloroplast, which is very close to that outer membrane. There's an intermembrane space there, but it's not much. Then you have all this space here. So there's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. Then you're going to have this space, the stroma. And then you have these sacs or these disks, and they're all kind of stacked together there, where the line I just drew there would be the TM, or the thylakoid membrane. And then the space inside there is the thylakoid space. And so they come in these stacks like this. And a stack, this is not really super important, but sometimes I refer to these, so it's important to know and be able to understand. The stack is called a granum. Right? So you have several stacks of these thylakoid membranes suspended in the stroma there. These stacks are sometimes connected together by another membrane, right, as well. So this is a granum, and then two would be grana, so the plural there. So if you look at the electron micrograph over here, you can see that these things here are the grana, right? stacks of them. And then like you can see the little connections between the stacks there in the electron micrograph. Okay, so structure of the chloroplast, important to know. What you should also do then is probably compare, contrast this to the mitochondrion. Right? So here we go. Photosynthesis in general is taking place in the chloroplast, the membrane-bound organelle. So we have two divisions here. We have these light reactions, which are also sometimes known as the light-dependent reactions, right? And I will just abbreviate them as LDR, the light-dependent reactions. And then the second main phase is the Calvin cycle. That Calvin cycle is also sometimes referred to as the LIR, at least by me, the light-independent reactions. The light-independent reactions, the Calvin cycle. Right? So two main phases. Unlike in respiration where we have three, glycolysis, Krebs, electron transport, here we have two, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions. So where are these things taking place? Well, the light-dependent reactions, if you look at them, they are taking place here on the thylakoid membrane. So we're going to have these things called photosystems, which we'll get into a little bit later and when we look at a detailed screencast of the light-dependent reactions. So the light-dependent reactions are happening on the thylakoid membrane. We're going to be using light. We're going to be using water. Right? And what else we're going to be using? We're going to be using NADP, which is similar but different than NAD+. And we're going to be using ADP and inorganic phosphates here. So these are our reactants. This is taking place on the thylakoid membrane. That's our location. And then our products of the light-dependent reactions would be oxygen gas out here, ATP, and NADPH. So again, this NADPH is similar to NADH, but it's different because it's spelled with a P. So the NADPH, this is the one that belongs with photosynthesis. They both begin with P, so that's kind of how I remember that. So again, this is taking place inside the chloroplast on the thylakoid membrane. If we look at the second phase here, the Calvin cycle, the light-independent reactions, they're independent because you don't need light, right? You don't see light coming in to this right side of the diagram at all. So the reactants of this are the ATP and the NADPH. These are reactants that are going into this Calvin cycle. Also CO2. This is also another reactant here that is going to enter this Calvin cycle. Products of the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions, would include NADP+, ADP and inorganic phosphate, as well as down here, organics. Look at our organics right over here. Organics, starches, carbohydrates, right? Amino acids, fatty acids, proteins, lipids, so carbs, lipids, proteins here. Right? So we're churning out organics there. If you take a look closely here, you see maybe an old friend, something that you recognize, G3P. And look, this is a cycle, so what does this kind of look like? You may be thinking, I've seen something like that before, but maybe in reverse. I don't know, maybe, yeah. So where is this Calvin cycle taking place? This Calvin cycle is taking place in the stroma. You notice that this is the stroma here. This is the space around the thylakoid membranes. Okay. So there's our locations, reactants, and products for photosynthesis. And finally here, photosynthesis as a redox, as a series of redox reactions. Well, you should be able to do this relatively easily here. Again, don't worry about the numbers so much, the stoichiometry, just be looking at this. So what's going to happen to this carbon dioxide? Well, this carbon dioxide is going to end up over here. So what do we say is happening to that carbon dioxide then? I'm pausing for you to answer. We say that this carbon dioxide is going to be reduced to organics. And then what's going to happen to this water? Well, here's the water, right? And this water is going to be here. So what's happening to the water? Yeah, that's right. The water is going to be oxidized to water over there. Now this gets a little tricky because we're also making some water over here. And the next graphic will kind of clear that up a little bit more for you. But in general, this is happening with the energy from light, and you need this pigment thing, chlorophyll, right here, which we will address in a different screencast. Okay? But this is it as a series of redox reactions. So in class, we'll ask you to be able to identify here what was oxidized, what's the reducing agent, what's reduced, what's the oxidizing agent, etc. So be able to do that. And finally, let's talk about that water. So the arrows here, this gets a little overwhelming if you just look at it, so you have to slow down and break this down. So look, here's our carbon dioxide, right? And the carbon is going to end up as the carbon in the organics. This oxygen ends up as the oxygen in the organics. It also ends up as some of the oxygen in the water. But what I want to emphasize right here, right now, is that this O2 in CO2 is not the O2 that comes out of the light-dependent reactions. This O2 is not the O2 from CO2. This carbon and this oxygen end up in the organics and end up in this water. Right? So really what's happening then, if you take this H2O, all of this oxygen that comes out that's a byproduct of photosynthesis is due to this oxygen right here in the water that goes in. Right? This water, right, is what you use to water your plants, right? Water your producers. Okay? So we're going to completely oxidize this water. Right? When you completely oxidize the water, you end up getting oxygen gas there. When you reduce this carbon dioxide thing, you're going to reduce it to mostly organics, but then there's a little bit of other complicated chemistry that is not really super important to know, but you also produce some water there, and that's how. Okay, so again, you should be able to describe the structure of the chloroplast, know the two main phases of photosynthesis, the reactants, products, locations, and purposes of each, and then be able to describe photosynthesis as a series of redox reactions. Thank you. Questions? Bring them to class. See ya.